Flameo Hotman, and welcome back to our analysis/review/ranking of the masterpiece that is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Last time we spent over an hour and a half discussing Book 1 Water, exploring its ups, its downs, and overall how brilliantly it laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. I cannot stress enough how fun of a video that was to make, definitely one of my all-time favorites on this channel, and I would seriously recommend checking it out first if you haven't already, just to get the full context of what we're doing here, because today, my friends, we will be spending an even longer amount of time tackling just the first half of Avatar's second season, also known as Book 2 Earth. Yes, I've decided to split this video into two. So today we will be discussing the first 10 episodes of this season, sharing thoughts, praises, critiques, spiritual revelations, and of course who the MVP is, before ranking each of them from worst to best. Although with a show and season like this, it's more like least life-changing to most life-changing. And it goes without saying that part 2 of this video, doing the exact same thing for episodes 11 to 20, will be coming out soon. Of course, once I've tackled Book 3 Fire as well, we'll be combining everything into like a 7-hour mega review, but let's stay in the present for now. Before diving into the individual episodes of Book 2 Earth, I thought I'd keep with tradition by discussing the season as a whole. Like I mentioned many times in that previous video, Book 1 Water is an incredibly solid season of television. One which I feel like can sometimes be just the tiniest bit underrated and underappreciated by the Avatar fandom. Yes, it's clearly a show still trying to find its feet with a more episodic Adventure of the Week format, a slightly less focused narrative, the occasional tonal wobble, and a few key characters not yet introduced. But even with all that in mind, I'd still argue that Avatar's first season accomplishes a tremendous amount. Most importantly, laying down an incredibly strong foundation of character, world building, thematic structure, and about a million other things, without which the brilliance of books 2 and 3 just wouldn't hit with nearly the same impact. Overall, it is your classic first act, a season that's doing much heavy lifting, setting the tone and emotional stakes, while still managing to tell a cohesive and enjoyable story in its own right. And let's also not forget that Book 1, despite its groundwork laying role, is home to some truly standout episodes such as The Storm, The Deserter, and The Siege of the North two-parter, all of which are genuinely excellent entries into this series, anchoring the season with some real dramatic weight and perfectly foreshadowing the quality of the show moving forward. So, why am I talking so much about Book 1? Like, haven't we done this already? Well, the reason I keep reiterating this point is so that when I say what I'm about to say, people don't think I'm hating on Avatar's first season. Because the truth is, no matter how you spin it, no matter how much justified praise you heap onto Book 1 Water, the reality is that Book 2 Earth is just completely superior in literally every single way. Like, from the first scene of the first episode of this season, you can just tell that something is different. Something clearly happened to the team behind this show in, late 2005, early 2006. I don't know if Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko and my guy Aaron Ehas sold their souls to the devil or something, I don't know, but it is obvious from the first frame, basically, that there has been a significant leap in quality. Not just in animation and production value, but in storytelling confidence and character writing and world building and overall ambition. It feels like the creators, with a season already under their wing, now fully understand the potential of this world they've built and these characters they've crafted. And now they're ready to push them somewhere deeper and far more emotionally resonant. And sure, we might disagree on just how big that leap in quality between books 1 and 2 is, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a single Avatar: The Last Airbender fan who doesn't believe that leap exists. But again, I must preface, this is not one of those shows which started off slow but eventually found its footing. No, this is an amazing show which became a generation-defining masterpiece. This season, along with Book 3 Fire, is honestly some of the best TV I have ever watched, some of the best art I have ever had the pleasure of experiencing. Now, whether Book 2 Earth is superior or equal or slightly worse than Book 3 Fire is a conversation I will leave for the final video of this project. Right now, we are focusing on Book 2, on the middle act of this story, and what a middle act it is. See, I feel like Act 2s often have this slight unfair advantage, if you will. With the groundwork already established and the climax still on the horizon, second acts exist in a kind of narrative sweet spot. It's the moment in a story where the writers have the most creative freedom to deepen character arcs, expand the world, introduce more complex themes, and let the emotional stakes evolve at their own pace. You're no longer bogged down by exposition, but you're also not constrained by the pressure of resolution. And that space, that breathing room, is often where stories do their best work. Think The Empire Strikes Back or The Two Towers, which are both my favourites in their respective trilogies. The middle is where things tend to get richer, darker, stranger, and more ambitious, and Book 2 Earth is of course no exception. It's also in this season that we start to see a stronger shift towards serialization and longer form storytelling. Yes, of course, the show has always had its overarching narrative, Aang mastering the elements and defeating the Fire Nation/Lord, but Book 2 is where we start getting arcs that span multiple episodes in a much more focused way. Think about the entire losing Appa storyline, not just the long-lasting emotional challenges, but the logistical nightmare of suddenly not having your pet aeroplane, and how that affects the pacing of the season. Think about the whole slow burn political conspiracy unfolding in Ba Sing Se. This kind of structural ambition allows the show not only to introduce new heroes, new villains, and bigger stakes, but also to dig deeper into the psychology and moral complexity of the characters we already know and love. And Book 2 is somehow able to achieve all of this while never losing sight of its episodic formula which worked so well in Book 1 Water. Because despite its larger scale and ambition, each episode still follows a clear 3-act structure, still feels like its own contained story, meaning you can throw on basically any episode at random and still feel like you've watched something complete. It really is, in my opinion, the perfect balance between the freedom of standalone storytelling and the emotional momentum of serialized arcs. And as I've already said, this overall boost in quality is evident from the very first episode of Avatar's second season. So let's finally get into it. Avatar's season openers tend not to be the flashiest episodes of the show. Their main function is basically to establish or re-establish the status quo. Update us on where the characters are at, emotionally, geographically, narratively, and to gently push the story back into motion. And Book 2 Earth's opener, the Avatar State, is a pretty perfect example of this in my opinion. Again, this is far from the flashiest, most high-stakes or plot-heavy episode we'll get this season, but the Avatar State still has a ton of ground to cover when you really think about it, a ton of stuff to convey, and I would argue that it basically executes it all flawlessly. We begin with a classic Aang dream sequence which deals with his trauma after turning into a spiritual fish monster at the end of last season and assumedly killing a bunch of people. You know, the classic stuff that all 12-year-olds have to deal with. And I love how this episode and season wastes zero time diving into Aang's psychological struggles as the Avatar, highlighting what is, for me, one of the show's most fascinating internal conflicts, that being the contrast between Aang as this friendly, innocent, carefree, peace-loving monk, and Aang as this messianic figure with supreme, sometimes uncontrollable levels of power, who is destined to save the world. It's an incredibly interesting point of tension in my opinion. It's one of the reasons I rate Aang so highly as a protagonist, and it will only become more prominent the further along we go in this series. Anyway, Team Avatar have now left the Northern Water Tribe where they were staying for around 6 weeks, I believe. We get another reminder from Master Pakku that Katara is now a waterbending master and will be teaching Aang moving forward, which again I do think is a bit of an abrupt power promotion, if you will, but whatever. She's a major protagonist in a Nickelodeon fantasy show, I'm not gonna lose sleep over it, and I could never stay mad at Katara for too long. We also here get Pakku updating us that Aang will now go to Omashu to learn earthbending under King Bumi, which is a nice early White Lotus link. Don't know how much they'd planned that storyline at this point, but it's still pretty cool. And then of course we cut to the B-plot of this episode, which begins with our boys Zuko and Iroh, who, after floating on a piece of driftwood for 3 weeks with no food or water and sea vultures waiting to pluck out their livers, are now chilling in some sort of serene Japanese cherry blossom massage and meditation retreat. Very nice stuff. Zuko is still a melodramatic teenager, constantly whining about his honor or his throne or whatever, but what's far more important is the following scene, where we finally get a proper introduction to the crown princess of the Fire Nation, Azula. And what an introduction it is. Of course, we've already had a couple of references to this character. Zuko briefly mentions her while monologuing to Aang, who's off tripping balls in the spirit world. And then of course there's the final scene of Book 1 where Ozai tasks her with hunting down her treacherous brother and uncle. But as intriguing as those early hints might have been, they never could have truly prepared us for the reality of Azula. Now, basically every time I rewatch Avatar: The Last Airbender, there's something new which I appreciate. Some moment I'd never fully clocked, some dynamic that lands even better than before, and honestly, I think that's the mark of truly great art. When every revisit reveals yet another layer of admiration, if you will. For example, I think it was my third or fourth watch, where Aang and Katara's relationship finally clicked for me. But with this rewatch, the one I'm doing for this video, I think it might be Azula. I think this might just be the moment I finally appreciate just how incredible of a character she really is. Because don't get me wrong, I've always loved Azula, always thought she was the show's standout antagonist. But while watching this season, and especially her perfect introduction in this episode, I've realized just how much she actually changes the stakes of this show for the better. See, in Book 1 Water, the main villains were Zhao, Zuko, and to an extent Iroh, with Ozai looming silently in the background. Now, I actually like Zhao quite a lot in that first season. He's a solid early obstacle for our protagonist to overcome. But let's be real, the guy is not exactly a powerhouse. He's overconfident and loses a lot. Zuko and Iroh, meanwhile, are no longer positioned as true villains. They're on their own path now. They got their own stuff to figure out. And Ozai, well, he needs to stay in the shadows for a bit longer. It will make his reveal in Book 3 that much more impactful. And so it is Azula who steps in to fill this vacuum, and I've basically boiled it down to two main reasons why she's such a great villain, why she's so terrifying. Number one, she is incredibly competent from both an intelligence and power point of view. Easily one of the best benders we see in the whole show. In just this first episode alone, we witness her generate lightning, which up to this point we've only seen a character redirect, as well as produce blue fire, which is honestly like such a Return of the Jedi green lightsaber moment. It's awesome. This season wastes absolutely no time showing us how much of a prodigy Azula is. And it will only continue from here. Her agile, varied, and aggressive bending style is consistently some of the most impressive on the show, and I think the writers do a really great job of keeping her threatening, even in a story where she's obviously not allowed to ever fully win. Unlike Zhao in Book 1, who was constantly getting humiliated, Azula's battles usually end in a stalemate, or, with Team Avatar just barely managing to escape. It's a smart way of maintaining tension while keeping her credibility intact. The second reason Azula makes for such a brilliant and terrifying villain is the fact that she's genuinely unhinged. Whereas Zuko is the show's most obvious example of physical abuse, scarred for life by his father, Azula is the product of psychological abuse. Zuko is broken on the outside, but kind of strong on the inside, right? Azula is the reverse, though. Composed, polished, and completely fractured within. It gives her this unnerving presence. Look no further than her first scene in this episode, the whole maybe you should worry less about the tides who've already made up their mind about killing you, and worry more about me who's still mulling it over thing. It's an unreal introduction to this character. Her voice is calm, Greg Leslie's performance is one of the best on the whole show, her movements are precise, her design is sharp and angular. That's a nice outfit, Azula. Be careful you don't puncture the... I can't remember it, sorry. And yet, she's deeply unpredictable. This might be a weird comparison, but she's kind of like Javier Bardem in No Country for Old Men. There's just no telling what she's gonna do. It's that combination of competency and psychopathy which feels so dangerous. And it's also what makes her such a tragic character, something the show will explore more and more as time goes on. But yeah, this all combines for a truly brilliant and memorable antagonist. Someone who is not just the best villain in the show, but one of two characters introduced in Book 2 who slot in so naturally, so perfectly, that you forget they were ever missing, but more on that later. The actual plot of this episode involves Aang, Katara, and Sokka meeting with General Fong, who is supposed to give them safe passage to Omashu. However, General Fong, after hearing of Aang's magical fish murderer exploits, claims that the young Avatar is already equipped to defeat the Fire Lord / nation and end the war. And honestly, I find this whole story and dynamic very interesting from a writing perspective. First of all, I think the show is absolutely right to address Aang's overwhelming display of power at the end of last season, and how that moment kind of undercuts the whole learn all 4 elements before facing Ozai plan. It raises the question, if Aang already has this near godlike power buried inside him, why not just use it to end the war? And in that sense, General Fong is kind of right. Maybe this will be seen as a controversial opinion, I don't know, but the guy's initial argument is sound, especially when he shows Aang all the wounded Earth Kingdom soldiers, and explains how they're the lucky ones. It's quite powerful and persuasive, actually. And yeah, of course, eventually General Fong goes a bit mad and tries to force Aang into the Avatar state by attacking him and pretending to suffocate the love of his life, but his initial point still stands, I think. And what makes this dynamic so interesting from a writing perspective is how it kind of becomes this meta commentary on storytelling structure itself, right? Just hear me out for a second. So Fong represents real world logic, yeah? Because despite Sokka insisting that Aang would lose in a fight against the Fire Lord, basically saying,
I don't think you have the facilities for that, big man. Do you understand? But big up, man.
Neither he nor we actually know anything about Ozai's power level at this stage, other than him being capable of burning a defenseless 13-year-old. But honestly, with hindsight and keeping Sozin's comet in mind, I reckon magical fish murderer Aang would absolutely wipe the floor with Ozai. So again, Fong is kind of right, even if his methodology is a little unsavory. Katara, on the other hand, represents traditional storytelling structure. In fact, it often feels like she's standing in for the writers themselves, you know, the ones committed to doing things the right way.
This is not the right way. There's a right way to do this. Practice, study, and discipline.
Structure, pacing, emotional and narrative development, 3 full seasons of practice and discipline, ending in a climactic fight and all loose ends being tied up. And honestly, some of the conversations in this episode feel like an internal writer's room debate playing out on screen. Do we rush to the end because we technically can? Or do we take the proper cathartic route, the one that gives the story and characters the most meaning and room to grow? It's pretty meta when you think about it, and look, overall, this is a really solid A-plot to kick this season off with, especially when it comes to the main action set piece, which involves Fong and his Earthbenders attacking the Avatar to try and force him into the Avatar state. I believe this is our first time seeing these iconic earthbending stone circles that become such a signature of the Earth Kingdom's aesthetic. This is also our first real look at airbending versus earthbending, which creates a really fun and dynamic visual contrast. Again, you can tell the choreography has stepped up a level from last season. The fights are tighter, more creative, and more visually expressive. And as a bonus, we also get a few brilliant transitions to the action of the B-plot, which we'll talk more about in a second. Anyway, eventually Fong turns his attention to Katara, and I love this really small bit where she tries to attack the general with water, and he just turns it into mud. It's pretty funny. But of course, eventually Aang goes into the Avatar state after believing Fong to have killed his soulmate. We see him execute this dazzling display of earthbending, very similar to his waterbending Avatar state attack in the 2nd episode of Book 1, taking out all those poor earthbenders before instantly being projected into the astral planes for a classic Roku exposition dump. And look, there's part of me who kind of wants to criticize this scene because it's very sudden and basically just exists to relay information. But I love the spiritual stuff so much in this show that I don't even really care. Like, we are literally watching a child monk receiving ancient sacred knowledge from his past self while riding a spirit dragon, as all their former incarnations look on from the clouds. It's like the cover of a Grateful Dead album or something. It's so amazing. Here we basically learn that if you're killed in the Avatar state, the cycle ends, which is a really great way to add stakes and not make the thing too overpowered. But anyway, we end this A-plot with Aang returning to his body and hugging Katara, who was actually fine the whole time, and Sokka boinking General Fong on the head. Which, don't get me wrong, the guy definitely deserved. You should not be attacking children. I know, hot take, but I still think his point about finishing the war kind of stands. And if anything, Aang going into the Avatar states once again and destroying everything only strengthens his argument. But I get it, it's not the right way. We don't have a story if Aang just decided to fight Ozai right now. And clearly being in such a powerful and vulnerable state takes its toll on the poor kid. So let's just leave it there and move on to the B plot, which involves Azula tracking down Zuko and Iroh under the pretense of delivering good news, that their exile has been lifted, that the Fire Lord wants them to return home. Zuko, being the emotionally fragile teenager that he is, buys into it immediately, despite his sister insulting him and patronizing him and even calling him Zuzu. However, Iroh is obviously far more suspicious, and I love how even the Dragon of the West, in all his wisdom and friendliness, seems trepidatious around Azula, even a little scared. Of course, Iroh is proven right in the end when the whole thing turns out to be a ruse. While he takes out the guards, Zuko takes on his sister with these dual fire daggers he generates, which are just so cool and really help us ignore the fact that he's fighting in his, yoga retreat clothes. However, Azula is able to play with him, basically, parrying his attacks and taunting him about his failures before going on the offensive with her signature blue fire and lightning. Iroh swoops in just in time to redirect said lightning, and the two of them escape, now officially fugitives of the Fire Nation. And I've always loved this closing scene when Zuko and Iroh cut off their top knots, a gesture with deep cultural resonance across several Asian traditions, especially in Japanese samurai culture, where removing one's top knot often symbolized disgrace, surrender, or a deliberate break from one's past identity. Again, just very interesting, nuanced spiritual stuff. Like, there's not even any dialogue in this scene, but it just relays so much from the visuals and music, and perfectly ends what is, in my opinion, a brilliant first episode of this new season. Again, it's not the flashiest, it doesn't have the most iconic story moments, but it does perfectly bring us back into this world with these characters and recalibrate, I guess, the vibes of the show moving forward. More direction, more momentum, more maturity, higher quality, higher stakes. It's amazing stuff. Oh, and I didn't even get to mention Lo and Lee, Azula's creepy twin advisors, who feel like elderly versions of the Shining twins. Anyway, the MVP of this episode is gonna have to be Iroh, for sticking with Zuko, for clocking immediately that something was up with Azula, and overall just being an intelligent badass with a kind heart. In general, this season, Iroh is just on full form, as is every other character. This really is peak art, guys, and it's a privilege to talk about it with you. But anyway, let's move on, because that episode took way too long to discuss, and it's not even like one of my favorites of the season or anything. I have no idea how long this whole project's gonna be once I finish it, but yeah. Now we can talk about the best episode of the show. Like I've already said numerous times, there's a clear boost in quality once you start Avatar's second season. And while this is obviously present in the huge plot-heavy episodes with all their iconic moments, I would argue that it's just as, if not more apparent, in Book 2's smaller, more quote-unquote fillery episodes. The kind of episodes that back in Book 1 might have felt like a light, breezy detour, but here suddenly feel far richer and weightier. Now, don't get me wrong, I think your appreciation of The Cave of Two Lovers is at least partially dictated by how you personally feel about Aang and Katara. If you're one of those people who don't like the couple, who think it's too forced or vanilla or whatever, I can't imagine you're going to be claiming this to be a masterpiece. However, as someone who has a real soft spot for the connection which builds between these two crazy kids, and as someone who genuinely adores these wandering hippies and thinks they're some of the best one-off characters in the whole show, The Cave of Two Lovers is obviously going to be a real personal favourite of mine. And it'll be interesting to see by the end of this video how it stacks up against the episodes with more obvious plot progression. But anyway, let's get into it. We begin with Katara teaching Aang waterbending, and I really do appreciate stuff like like this. Don't get me wrong, I would have loved to have seen a little more of Aang actually learning the elements across the whole show, especially when it comes to earthbending, which is a criticism we'll get to later. But short moments like this still do a good job of showing us that Aang's training is ongoing, while reinforcing those important themes of practice and discipline. Anyway, we are then of course introduced to, in all honesty, some of my favourite characters in the entire show. I am of course referring to Chong and his merry band of free-loving nomad friends. Now, why do I like these hippies so much? Well,
because I am one?
but it's also much more than that. I actually think there's something quietly brilliant about their inclusion in this story. See, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a show filled with old monks, celestial dragons, ancient rituals, and reincarnated wisdom. It presents a world which kind of runs on spirituality, if that makes sense. So much of the show's runtime is dedicated towards exploring different philosophies, disciplines, and ways of being, often through mentors and elders who seem to embody some higher form of understanding. But what I really appreciate is how the show also makes space for characters like Chong and his free-spirited family, whose personality and way of living, I would argue, point towards the exact same kind of wisdom as all the more overtly spiritual figures in the story. Yes, these nomads are predominantly comic relief, and their countercultural antics are genuinely hilarious. But clearly they are tuned into something. They have indeed #escaped the culture, and now live in harmony with the world around them. And while they may speak more in stoner cliches than riddles or proverbs, the philosophy they're pointing towards, at least in my opinion, isn't all that different from what characters like Iroh or Gyatso or Guru Patik are trying to pass down. It's alignment, you know, presence, walking the way of nature, letting the universe carry you instead of constantly trying to force your way through it. Honestly, it feels kind of silly to admit, but these characters have probably influenced my own life more than I even realize. I remember randomly watching this episode in quite a lonely and difficult chapter of my life. It was right before COVID, actually, and I was just so transfixed by the aura of these people, the music, the nomadic life, the way they just floated through the world without clinging to anything. I remember thinking to myself, wow, there is real truth to how these people live their lives, and I think this is what I eventually want from my own. And look, nearly 6 years later, don't get me wrong, I've still got a ton of work to do. I still suffer from a small case of destination fever, but I do now travel the world, happy to go wherever the wind takes me. I'm currently recording this video from the southwestern coast of India, in case you're interested, and I really do think I partially have Avatar: The Last Airbender to thank for that. Not just Chong and his hippie friends, but all the characters who inhabit this world, each of them searching for a path that aligns with who they really are. What an incredible show, man. But anyway, let's get back to the episode. Team Avatar cross paths with Team Chong, let's call them, and honestly, this is one of the funniest episodes of the whole show. Pretty much every interaction and line of dialogue is hilarious, especially from Chong himself, who's voiced by the great D. Bradley Baker, the man responsible not only for Appa and Momo, but also Penny the Platypus. But yeah, the voice acting for Chong is note perfect here, as is all the music him and his companions play throughout the episode. Obviously Secret Tunnel gets all the plaudits, but every song is brilliant in my opinion. Like, how does it go? Don't fall in love with the traveling girl, she'll leave you broken hearted. Hey, river people! We're not river people. You're not? Well then what kind of people are you? Just people. Aren't we all, brother? Oh man, honestly, I could spend like 10 minutes just quoting this entire episode. Both all the more iconic lines and the jokes which go a bit more under the radar. Such as when Sokka says, "Look, I hate to be the wet blanket here, but since Katara is busy, I guess it's up to me." Just such good writing. But anyway, after encountering much fire and violence in their attempt to fly to Omashu, something they probably should have picked up on, as I feel like it kind of foreshadows the fate of that city, Team Avatar are forced to travel through the titular Cave of Two Lovers with Team Chong.
Secret love cave, let's go.
Sokka, whose pragmatic straight man energy contrasts beautifully with the hippies, is reluctant to go through these secret tunnels, especially after Chong warns them that the caves are cursed, and that only those who trust in love will make it through. But Aang, being a 12-year-old monk harboring a huge crush on his waterbending teacher, has no worries they'll make it through. And anyway, they kind of have to enter the cave after spotting smoke in the distance, which is no campfire, Moku, but the Fire Nation tracking them down. And I love that these fascist soldiers not only know about the supposed curse, but actually respect it enough not to follow them in. Instead, they just blow the entrance shut, leaving our heroes trapped. And if I had $1 for every time Sokka remained stoic in a time of crisis and immediately started coming up with a plan, I would be as rich as the Beifongs. Also, this joke with the torches is genuinely comic genius.
Chong, how long do those torches last?
About 2 hours each.
And we have 5 torches, so that's 10 hours.
It doesn't work like that if they're all lit at the same time!
It's just the confidence in which she lights all the torches at once just always gets me. Meanwhile, in the B-plot, which doesn't take up too much of this episode's runtime, Iroh and Zuko are now refugees. And honestly, I find this whole phase of their journey much more compelling than the Season 1 boat-chasing Avatar stuff. Gone are the crew, the resources, the mission, and the purpose. Instead, we simply get to see these two people as people. Improvising, adapting, surviving, catching hilariously minuscule fish, and crucially this episode marks the beginning of what I consider to be one of the most powerful and mature arcs in the whole show, and one of the key building blocks in Zuko's redemption, that being his gradual shift in perspective, as he starts to see the Fire Nation from the outside, starts to recognize the true levels of terror which his extended family has inflicted upon the world over the past century. In this episode specifically, he and Iroh are taken in by a kind Earth Kingdom girl named Song, someone who, like him, bears the scars of Fire Nation violence. They even share a quiet moment together, and while Zuko at this point is still way too indoctrinated, conflicted, and angry to truly connect with this young woman, even stealing her family's ostrich horse in one of the biggest dick moves of the entire series, this interaction does begin to sow the seeds of Zuko very slowly realizing the error of his ways, and how he too needs to #escape the culture. Anyway, let's get back to the secret love cave where our heroes are eventually split into 2 groups. Sokka and Momo are stuck with the hippies, much to his dismay and our delight as it's a brilliant dynamic, while Appa third wheels with Aang and Katara, who eventually stumble upon a tomb.
This isn't the exit. No. It's a tomb.
This is no mine. It's a tomb.
Is that a reference? Like, is that intentional? If it is, that is just unreal. Inside, they discover the story of Oma and Shu, 2 lovers from warring villages who met in secret and created this labyrinth as a way to be together. It's a very Romeo and Juliet kind of tale, beautifully elevated by the traditional art style, and that soft kalimba-infused Avatar's love theme which plays in the background. It's a simple but rather moving scene, actually, explaining the origins of Omashu while serving as another reminder of how well this show can shift tone when it wants to. And by the time Katara has finished the story, the romantic vibrations are off the scales, man. Katara, who famously shows zero interest in Aang until Sozin's comet, nervously brings up the idea of them kissing. And honestly, I find Aang and Katara's back and forth here to be so incredibly endearing and realistic for people of their age. Especially this moment.
No, I mean, if it was a choice between kissing you and dying... What? I'm saying I would rather kiss you than die. That's a compliment.
Which, in my opinion, is just one of the greatest and most quotable lines in the whole show. Honestly, we talk about Zuko's redemption, but later on we'll discuss the evolution of Aang's game, the best written arc of the entire series. Eventually, of course, these 2 crazy kids with famously zero chemistry at all end up sharing an intimate moment in the dark, activating some sort of spirit magic which shows them the way out of the tunnel. Not really sure why they didn't just use an escape rope, but anyway. Sokka, Momo, and the hippies are also eventually able to find their way out with the help of Bejamos, who earthbend their tunnels, hate the wolf bats, but love the sounds. Honestly, just such a great full circle moment of Sokka playing the music and feeling the love. It's just classic Avatar The Last Airbender 3rd act stuff. And even in these final couple moments, once the 2 groups are reunited in the open air, there's just so many brilliant small moments. Like Appa and Momo sharing their respective cave experiences, or Sokka and Katara hugging each other, or basically any line from any of the hippies.
So are you guys gonna come to Omashu with us?
Nope.
Okay.
Eventually, Chong and his group leave the show the same way they entered it, singing songs and going wherever the wind takes them. And while I would have loved to have seen more of these guys, I couldn't possibly think of a more fitting conclusion to their characters. And one more thing, is Sokka aware of what's going on between his sister and elemental monk Jesus? Because it's never really explored that much, but he does give them this very knowing look right at the end, which I do find pretty intriguing. But anyway, the episode ends with Team Avatar finally reaching Omashu, only to discover that it's fallen to the Fire Nation, which, again, I feel like should have been more obvious considering what happened earlier on in the episode, but whatever. It's a sharp tonal shift from the playful romantic vibes we've just spent 20 minutes soaking in, but it works really well while perfectly setting the stage for what comes next. Overall, The Cave of Two Lovers is obviously a real personal favourite of mine. I rewatched the episode for the millionth time just yesterday and was incredibly impressed with how tight the script is, how many of the jokes still make me laugh out loud even now. There's really not a single thing I would change about this episode, and again, it will be interesting to see where I end up ranking this come the end of this whole thing. Because yes, it is basically a perfect 23 minutes of Avatar The Last Airbender in my opinion, but it naturally doesn't carry the same weight or narrative momentum as some of the more pivotal episodes we'll be covering later on in the season. So to be honest, I'm not too sure what to do there. Ranking episodes of a show where not every chapter is trying to do the same thing is a pretty complicated and interesting conundrum, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. As for the MVP of this episode, I was originally going to go Aang for the whole "I'm saying I'd rather kiss you than die" phenomenon. Then I was thinking Sokka for being just such a brilliant leader and foil to the hippies. But at the end of the day, I just decided, who are we kidding? The MVP is obviously Chong, just a hilarious character whose approach to life I think we can all learn something from. Also, at one point he literally says the tunnels are a-changing, a reference to the iconic Bob Dylan song, so yeah, if he had referenced the Beatles as well, it would have probably been game over. Return to Omashu is probably the most plot-heavy episode of Book 2's first quarter. We begin right where The Cave of Two Lovers ended off, with Team Avatar having to deal with the ramifications of this once great Earth Kingdom stronghold now being occupied by the Fire Nation. And honestly, it's pretty funny to think that all the stuff with Aang and Katara and the Bedjamoles literally just happened like a few minutes ago. But anyway, the two Water Tribe siblings want to leave. However, Aang, being the absolute legend he is determined to find King Bumi, who isn't just an incredibly powerful earthbender and potential teacher, but also one of the last traces of Aang's old pre-iceberg life, his only remaining friend from that time period as far as I'm aware. And so Team Avatar break into the city through the sewers, eventually evading some Fire Nation guards by pretending Sokka has a terminal illness. Hey, I think I heard of Pentapox. Didn't your cousin Chang die of it? We also here have Aang guessing that King Bumi was put somewhere made of metal so that he cannot bend, and I love how this idea that earthbenders can't bend metal is reminded to us multiple times throughout this series, for very specific reasons that we'll get into near the end of this video. We are then introduced to the first of two characters in this episode who will go on to become pretty significant side characters in the series. Mei is the daughter of Omashu's new Fire Nation governor, and she's immediately established as this stone-faced, deadpan, very dry presence, which makes for a fun contrast with our usual cast. And overall, I've really come to appreciate Mei as a character in my last few watches. I think there's some real emotional complexity and sensitivity behind all the boredom and apathy, and plus, she's just got a very memorable design and is one of the most unique and dangerous non-benders we meet in the whole show, but more on that in a bit. Aang actually ends up saving Mei and her family from what turns out to be an attack from the Omashu resistance, which is a pretty cool addition to this story with obvious links to the real world. Obviously, Aang didn't know it was a resistance attack in the moment, but I'm curious to know what the young monk would have done if he did know, considering his ethics. But anyway, Team Avatar get talking to one of the leaders of the resistance, my guy Young, who reveals that King Bumi instantly surrendered to the Fire Nation upon their invasion of the city. Now, no one really knows why Bumi did this, but Young is nevertheless determined to fight back. However, Aang basically says to him,
I don't think you have the facilities for that, big man. Do you understand?
He literally tells the resistance that they're outnumbered, that it's impossible for them to win, and that now is the time to flee Omashu so they can live to fight another day. Which, Okay, sounds like solid advice, but why is Aang pretending that the Resistance didn't literally just plan a perfect assassination attempt on Mei's family? Which would have been successful if it wasn't for him messing everything up. Now, I'm not saying that the moral of Avatar The Last Airbender is you should kill all your enemies, nor that a crushed Fire Nation noble family wouldn't probably just have led to an even stronger and more violent clampdown from Ozai. But come on, Aang, like, show a little bit of self-awareness here. Anyway, Sokka comes up with a plan, classic Sokka, to fake a disease outbreak as cover for everyone to escape the city. Pentapox? I'm pretty sure I've heard of that. The joke lands both times. Meanwhile, Aang finds and frees Flopsy, King Boomy's pet goat gorilla, which is an insane sentence to say out loud, while Mei's baby brother accidentally ends up in the arms of the Resistance after a comical, Charlie Chaplin-esque chase scene involving Momo and his incredibly grabbable tail. Eventually, Team Avatar, the Resistance, Young, Appa, Flopsy, and TomTom, the baby, are all outside the city. Young gets a bit melodramatic about how TomTom will eventually become a Fire Nation soldier, and I do love how this show acknowledges such uncomfortable truths about humanity. It's similar to in Sozin's Comet when we see that haunting picture of Fire Lord Ozai as a baby. This is just a level of nuance you don't usually see in shows originally intended to mainly be for children, and I have to applaud it. Soon after, a messenger hawk arrives from Mei's family with an offer to swap King Boomy with their son, who they of course believe the Resistance has kidnapped for ransom or something. But let's stop right there and catch up on Azula, who is chilling with Lo and Lee. We get that iconic but chilling music, you know, the and this basically all leads to Azula getting her own little heist team-up episode. She deserves it. It's her Fast Five, if you will, and the first recruit is Ty Lee, a former classmate of Azula's from the Royal Fire Academy for Girls, now loving her best life as an acrobat in the circus. And let's just say that these two have a bit of a tense relationship. Ty Lee is clearly not that comfortable around Azula, who would be, you know, she's an absolute sociopath. And we see that here as Azula perfectly manipulates Ty Lee to join her crew the only way she knows how, through fear and power and passive aggression and fire. Of course, her second recruit is Mei, and the arrival of the princess in Omashu is honestly one of my favourite cuts in the whole show.
I'm sure the governor wants his son back as much as we want Boomy. It's a new day. I have a good feeling about this.
Just perfectly sums up the impending and inevitable doom her character usually tends to bring. But yeah, Azula, Mei, and Ty Lee are now reunited. Clearly they've all known each other for years. And this trio will serve as a pretty brilliant set of antagonists for the foreseeable future. Not only do they have great chemistry together, both as personalities and as fighters, but there's also a lot of unspoken tension simmering beneath the surface. And I really can't wait to explore the truth of their dynamic, especially in episodes such as The Beach and The Boiling Rock. Oh my god, that moment in the Boiling Rock. Oh my god, I can't even think about it right now. The goosebumps I get just from imagining that scene. Man, the Book 3 Fire video is gonna be crazy, guys, when it eventually comes out in 2027. Anyway, Azula shows her brilliant empathy skills to Mei's father.
Yes, I'm so sorry to hear about your son.
Before deciding that she will deal with this trade of hostages herself. Oh, and that Omashu is now to be called New Ozai. I mean, yeah, sure, why not? Now, don't get me wrong, this episode has been relatively enjoyable so far, but this trade-off and the ensuing skirmish is definitely where Return to Omashu peaks. Honestly, any episode where different characters from different factions cross over is gonna be good. Here, Team Avatar and Team Azula, let's call them, meet at the Ozai statue scaffolding site, which does just remind me of that one video.
That's why your shoes raggedy. That's why your mama dead. Dead as hell. What shoes she got on? What shoes she had on her casket?
We get confirmation that Boomy is still alive and kicking. However, Azula realizes that trading an earthbending master for a baby is a little silly. I mean, it's coughing baby versus hydrogen bomb, literally, so she backs out. And Mei just completely goes along with this. Like, I get that she's supposed to be this apathetic person, but that's literally your brother, Mei. You could at least pretend to care. What follows, though, is a pretty compelling fight sequence, in my opinion, with Aang going after Boomy and Azula going after Aang, leaving Mei, Ty Lee, Katara, and Sokka to duke it out. The action between these four is pretty strong, especially as it's our first proper introduction to Mei's throwing knives and Ty Lee's chi blocking, which are both just very fun and exciting fighting styles to watch. I especially love the moment Ty Lee sneak attacks Sokka through the floor, right before Katara fires up these wooden planks with waterbending to use as a shield against Mei's knives. It's just awesome choreography, which properly takes advantage of the unique environment. Very nice stuff. However, Aang's chase with Azula might be even better. Now, I've already spoken about this, but I have to reiterate. There's a lot that makes Azula so threatening. Her voice, her coldness, her genuine belief in her family's divine right to rule. But when it comes down to it, Azula is frightening because she is competent. And that is put on full display here as she proves just how much of a prodigy she really is. Going toe-to-toe with the Avatar. She is fast, agile, confident, intelligent, can even block airbending somehow. She just has that perfect blend of cold composure with just enough instability and unpredictability to keep things interesting. Just a dangerous character, man. Anyway, eventually Appa saves Katara and Sokka for the millionth time, and we get this absolutely hilarious moment where Aang tries to flick Bumi's metal coffin onto the Sky Bison's back. Like, what was your expected outcome from that move, brother? Like, what did you think was gonna happen? We eventually get this great reveal that King Bumi has been able to earthbend the whole time, which allows him and Aang to escape Azula's clutches and have a nice spiritual conversation about Jing and waiting and knowing when to strike and when to do nothing. It's pretty interesting, showing Bumi's unconventional but effective wisdom, as well as foreshadowing Aang's search for an earthbending teacher who understands the art of waiting. We're nearly there, guys, we're nearly there. The episode ends with Bumi telling Aang that he has to stay in Omashu for now, but that they will meet again soon. Fun fact, they never interact again for the rest of the show. Also, Team Azula are now hunting the Avatar as well as Zuko, who doesn't appear in this episode, and Aang gives Tom Tom back to his family as an act of goodwill. Aww. Overall, Return to Omashu is what I would call a rock-solid episode of Avatar The Last Airbender. Sure, it takes until the final third to really kick into gear, but it does do quite a lot of important setup, so I can't get too mad. And the MVP is gonna have to be Azula, for reasons I've already explained. She just raises the stakes of this show so much. I don't have anything too complex to say about the swamp. Similar to the Cave of Two Lovers, this is not the most canonical, story-heavy episode, and I can't imagine too many Avatar fans are gonna have it too high up in their own rankings. In fact, I can even see some people having this as the single worst episode of Book 2. However, for me, personally, the swamp is actually a bit of an underrated gem. Yes, it might not be the most insane episode for plot or character, it might not be as funny or iconic as The Cave of Two Lovers, but what can I say? With this one, it is all about the vibes, man, which are quite frankly just off the scale here. They're somewhere on the astral planes. Honestly, this is one of those episodes I'll often just put on at random, even when I'm not doing a watch through of the show, purely due to its vibrational frequency. First of all, this is indeed the episode where we get the privilege of hearing Iroh sing It's a Long, Long Way to Ba Sing Se, a staple of many an Avatar fan's musical diet, my own included. Not only is it unironically a really good song, but it's also just great world building. I love it when writers, especially fantasy writers, bake cultural context into songs and stories and little throwaway jokes. It's something George R.R. Martin does really well in A Song of Ice and Fire. It just fleshes out the world, you know, makes it feel a bit more lived in and real. And in the case of Ba Sing Se, this isn't the first time we've heard the name this season, and it certainly won't be the last. The writers are clearly laying the groundwork here, building up the city's legend in our minds before we ever actually set foot there. But second, and more importantly, let's discuss the episode's A-plot, the titular swamp. Like, guys, do I even need to do some in-depth analysis of this? If you heard my whole spiel on the Cave of Two Lovers, you can probably guess exactly how I feel about this episode. I mean, for God's sake, Team Avatar are sucked into a swamp, hallucinate people from their past and future, are attacked by this huge vine monster who turns out to be a tree Buddhist named Hugh, who proceeds to give them an enlightening Ram Dass, Alan Watts, Terence McKenna talk about nature and trees and how we're all one and everything. And on top of all of this, we have Momo and Appa going on some side quest where they're chased down by these hilarious Floridian hillbillies who use their own brand of swamp waterbending to emulate jet skis. And, all in the same episode, we get this hilarious and incredibly underrated joke.
Sokka, you've got an elbow leech.
Where?
Where do you think?
So yeah, the swamp was always going to be a personal favourite of mine. There's something pretty haunting and enigmatic and magical about the whole thing, especially when it comes to the brushstrokes of horror which permeate the episode, as well as of course the location. Would not surprise me at all if the writers were thinking about Dagobah from The Empire Strikes Back when mapping this episode out. And the respective visions, Katara seeing her mother, Sokka seeing Yue, Aang seeing this mysterious girl we'll definitely never hear from again, they're each quietly powerful in their own way. Then of course there's Hugh, and honestly, everything I said about Chong applies to him too, just through a slightly less flower child, slightly more swamp wizard lens. That final speech he gives about nature and connection and everything being part of the same whole is genuinely one of the best pieces of dialogue in the entire show. I'd play it here, but it is a bit long, so seriously, go look it up right now if you haven't heard it in a while. Just beautiful stuff, man, and more proof from this show that real wisdom can be found in the most unlikely of places, and that we should probably all just go live in nature and meditate all day. This episode ends with Team Avatar hanging out with Hugh and the Floridians, which leads to some pretty funny lines.
They got a nice swamp there, do they?
No, it's all ice and snow.
No wonder you left.
And we also have Zuko once again putting on his blue spirit mask to give the guy who was taunting Iroh earlier a nice proper scare. So look, overall I understand that most people aren't going to show the same level of adoration and appreciation towards the swamp that I do, but at the end of the day I just love the kinds of lessons this show slips into its weirdest corners, and this episode in particular delivers one of the very best. And as for the MVP, it's obviously Hugh. Time is an illusion, and so is death. Moving on. In my opinion, Avatar Day is the single weakest episode of Book 2 Earth, and perhaps the only time in the entire season where it feels like I'm watching Book 1 again. You know what I mean? There's just something about the episode's structure and formula of Team Avatar, you know, going to some village and getting into some low-stakes shenanigans, which really reminds me of Book 1. And I feel like Avatar Day stands out even more because, I don't know, it really felt like the season was building some momentum, you know, that we were really beginning to dive into the nitty-gritty of Book 2, only for us to get this random detour where Aang has to prove Kyoshi's innocence from something she may or may not have done 370 years ago. And what makes it even worse is that the 2 episodes after Avatar Day are 2 of the best episodes of the entire season, and arguably the whole show. I mean, I don't know yet, we'll have to wait and see, but regardless, Avatar Day is wedged between so many great and iconic episodes that its placement just feels a little awkward and out of place. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not a bad episode of Avatar The Last Airbender. It is actually very funny, and you could very easily make the argument that it acts as a deliberate moment of levity, strategically placed to lighten the tone and let us breathe before we plunge into some of the season's darker, more emotionally intense material. And yeah, fair enough, I understand that sentiment. It just comes a bit out of nowhere for me, and is a clear drop-off from literally every other Book 2 episode in my opinion. Like, for example, I find the action in Avatar Day to be really subpar. The fights in this episode kind of remind me of Pokemon, just in how slow and turn-based everything feels. And the story is just so insignificant. Like, don't get me wrong, the whole Zuko Iroh B plot is important, but the whole A plot with the titular Avatar Day, I just don't really understand why the writers thought this was a necessary arc to develop. Like, if you're gonna have this story involving people hating the Avatar, at least link it to Aang's guilt and trauma like The Storm does so well, instead of, you know, having this random Kyoshi business. However, with that all being said, I still actually like this episode quite a lot. First of all, just because Avatar Day feels like it should be in Book 1 instead, that doesn't mean it's bad. Let me remind you, I love Book 1. I made a 96-minute video about Book 1. This is still a very watchable 23 minutes of Avatar The Last Airbender, and not an episode I would ever even think about skipping. I mean, compared to The Great Divide, Avatar Day is a masterpiece, and yeah, most of that comes from the comedy. In just this episode alone, we get such iconic moments and lines as hair loopies, Aang tricking Sokka into being a detective, Sokka actually being a detective with his monocle and pipe, which is all hilarious. I do believe in the power of stuff. The return of Foaming Mouth Guy, the classic subversion of the prisoners actually being decent people, who here help Aang with his girl problems. This moment...
So the sun must have been in the west.
So what?
Miss Kiyoshi.
Zachary Tyler Einson's delivery of this line.
I'm not guilty.
And Aang doing his best Kyoshi impression.
Hey everybody, Avatar Kyoshi here.
And I'll admit, the flashback of Kyoshi creating her own island through what is surely the most powerful display of bending we ever see in the whole show is pretty badass. It's just a shame that the action set piece which comes right after this is, again, kind of lame and slow. As for the B-plot of this episode, it's really quite good, actually, especially Iroh's speech to Zuko about hope and their eventual departure from one another. However, it does feel a little jarring tonally compared to the comedic, low-stakes breeziness of the A-plot. But yeah, overall Avatar Day is my least favourite episode of the season, but honestly, I still have it higher than like nearly half of Book 1, which shows you just how highly I rate Book 2. There's just something about the comedy of this one which gets to me, especially with Sokka, who obviously gets the MVP award here.
This is by far the worst town we've ever been to.
I often talk about the episodes in Avatar The Last Airbender that serve as turning points. Those moments where the writers reveal they've got yet another gear to shift into, another notch to kick up, if you will. Examples of these game-changing episodes include The Storm, which got its own separate video on this channel, The Siege of the North 2-parter, and the Avatar State, which I spoke about earlier. However, The Blind Bandit, the 6th episode of Book 2 Earth, might just be the most significant example of this. For me, this is really where Avatar hits its peak. A peak it will basically ride out for the rest of the show. It's always one of the episodes I look out for whenever doing a rewatch, because I really feel like it's where everything fully clicks into place, you know? The moment the image of Avatar The Last Airbender you keep in your head finally materializes on screen in all its complete excellence, if that makes sense. And look, this is partially just due to the legendary run of episodes which The Blind Bandit kicks off. If you actually look at the remaining 15 entries into Book 2, they're basically all amazing. So it's overall just an exciting checkpoint in the series. But of course, The Blind Bandit also serves as our introduction to Toph Beifong, the final major character to join the cast and a true fan favourite. I feel like Toph is similar to Azula in the way she impacts the story. Both characters slot into the world so effortlessly at the beginning of Book 2, you forget there was ever a version of the show without them. And I reckon this is partially why a certain number of Avatar fans out there don't really rate Book 1 that much. Because once you go back with the knowledge of characters like Azula and Toph, the show does admittedly feel a little incomplete without them. And I think part of the reason Toph feels so integral so quickly is because this episode does such a brilliant job of introducing her. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that when it comes to character introductions, this might just be one of the best of all time. We begin with Team Avatar at yet another Earth Kingdom town. Sokka, who is hilarious throughout this episode, buys this really awkward looking bag, which I don't remember actually serving a narrative purpose, but it does make for some great jokes, so fair enough. Eventually Aang, who of course is still searching for an earthbending teacher, is invited to check out Master Yu's Earthbending Academy, which is honestly just a really great and specific satire of those dodgy bullshido dojos which give martial arts schools a bad name. However, when that proves to be far from the neutral Jing, waiting and listening type of teaching that Aang is searching for, Team Avatar instead end up at Earth Rumble 6, an underground earthbending WWE mashup which Katara locates by assaulting 2 children. One thing I really appreciate about The Blind Bandit is how the episode is paced and structured. The writers made the smart choice to drop the B-plot entirely. There is no Iroh here, no Zuko, no cutaways to anything else, which means we get the whole episode to focus on introducing this new character, and they don't waste any time. Within a couple of minutes, we're already at Earth Rumble 6, which is not just a brilliant homage to wrestling, but the best display of earthbending as a martial art we've seen up until this point. It's honestly so fun watching The Boulder, a hilarious if obvious nod to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, defeat this diverse roster of earthbenders, who all have slightly different fighting styles and choreography. I especially love the big bad hippo, who literally is seen eating rock at one point. Like, this is absolutely insane, man. Oh, and while this is all happening, we obviously have Sokka being once again the funniest character in the whole show. And we have people riding bedromals to clean the stage of rubble. I genuinely find it so funny how animals which were presented as so mythic and scary just 4 episodes ago are now being utilized for throwaway visual gags like this. Absolutely genius stuff. And then we have the introduction to your champion, the Blind Bandit, aka Toph Beifong. Now, I have watched this scene quite a few times over the past few days, and I've actually concluded that it's perfect. Like, there is nothing I could do to this scene which would make this character introduction better. From Toph's design, to Michaela Jill Murphy's voice, to the cinematography, to the editing, to just the incredible way they were able to portray Toph's seismic sense. I especially love the moment when the camera pans across Aang's face, who's just following the fight with such amazement, because he knows in that moment he's found his teacher. So then of course Aang goes up to fight Toph, because he wants to talk to her. And I love how in their short ensuing fight, we don't actually see the seismic sense. The action moves a lot faster and gives us the opportunity to witness what it's like from both Toph's perspective and from an outsider's perspective. Anyway, Aang dethrones this 12-year-old blind girl through an illegal airbending push, which Sokka is happy about because now he has found a belt to go with his bag. Just as a side note, I love how throughout this episode, Sokka just kind of takes the belt for himself and kind of acts like it's his. It's just so funny. However, Toph is upset, as is the boulder and the wrestling announcer guy, who thinks Aang took a dive, which is just a great phrase, and I love that they use it here. After Katara once again threatens the kids she previously assaulted for making an innocent joke, Team Avatar realise they're looking for the Beifong family. Oh, and of course we get this moment.
Hey, I got my eye on you.
Water tribe.
And I always forget that instead of knocking on Toph's parents' door, they just like trespass in their garden and start looking for their child. Like, Aang, you're the Avatar, you're the messiah of this world. You know you have the street credentials to invite yourself unannounced basically anywhere. And I know you know this because you do it 1 minute later. Sorry, not trying to get all cinema sins on you guys. I just find it funny how they break into this family's garden when there's literally no need to. Anyway, the dinner which Team Avatar and Toph's family have is pretty funny, especially this bit.
How much longer do you think the war will last?
I'd like to defeat the Fire Lord by the end of summer.
I just love how casually this 12-year-old talks about the eventual duel he's gonna have with a fascist warmongering psychopath who can shoot fire. Eventually, Toph calms down and has a nice chat with Aang about her life and her blindness and her connection to earthbending and how her parents just don't understand her, before they are both captured by the wrestling people and brought to the Earth Rumble stage for yet another trade of hostages. And honestly, this fight where Toph takes on every single one of the wrestlers by herself simultaneously is some of the best action Avatar: The Last Airbender has delivered to us thus far. Such amazing, diverse, creative choreography, especially the moment she rotates the Earth Circle so that 3 of them take each other out. And I love Sokka fainting upon Toph defeating Jin Fu, Earth Rumble 6's announcer. And just to let you guys know, I am a bit of a Sokka Toph shipper, so keep that in mind, maybe, if you care. Anyway, the Blind Bandit ends with Master Yu claiming Toph is the greatest earthbender he's ever seen. But Toph's father somehow comes to the conclusion that this means he needs to confine his daughter even more. At first, Toph is resigned to her fate, but soon realizes she needs to #escape the culture, and so joins Team Avatar as Aang's earthbending teacher. She even is able to get her belt back, which I guess Appa just has to carry for the rest of the series. Oh, and we get this short scene where Toph's old man pays Jin Fu and Master Yu to retrieve Toph as he believes Aang has kidnapped her, leading to one of the more underwhelming arcs of the entire series, but more on that later. Overall, this is just a killer episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I really don't have any notes. It perfectly introduces Toph, who obviously gets the MVP here. The script is just so tight and well paced. It gives us some of the best action of the entire series, and honestly, it might just be the best episode we've spoken about so far in either of these videos. Although, unfortunately for the Blind Bandit, I think that honor is only gonna last for a few more seconds. Zuko Alone was always going to be an incredible 22 minutes of Avatar. Up until this point, every episode of this show has followed Aang, Katara, and Sokka as the primary focus. Zuko and Iroh have, of course, remained central to the story, but they're usually in the B-plot, and occasionally they don't appear at all. At best, Zuko will share A-plot duties with Aang, like in The Storm, for example. However, Zuko Alone, the 7th episode of Avatar's 2nd season, breaks this pattern entirely, centering the narrative solely around everyone's favourite Fire Nation prince and delivering easily one of the best episodes in the entire show. And can we please discuss the absolute bollocks of whoever decided to place this episode immediately after the Blind Bandit? It's just such an insane 1-2 punch that, especially after Avatar Day, kinda just comes out of nowhere. And to think the chase is right after this as well, what a 3-episode run, man. That's like in the Beatles' White Album when you get While My Guitar Gently Weeps, then Happiness Is a Warm Gun, then Martha My Dear. It's like, guys, slow down. My mind can only process a certain amount of amazing art at once. Anyway, Zuko Alone is this beautifully stripped back, Western-inspired character piece. One that explores his traumatic past, the tension of his present, and the looming uncertainty of his future. And it takes place during a time where his moral compass has never felt shakier. Having left Iroh a couple of episodes ago, he now wanders the Earth Kingdom on the ostrich horse he stole from that family who his family caused incredible levels of physical, emotional, and spiritual damage to. We get this wholesome moment where he nearly steals this couple's food, but stops upon seeing that the woman is pregnant. Not only is this the first episode of characters who will actually appear in 5 episodes across these next 2 seasons, which is more than many of the show's most iconic side characters, but it also does a perfect job of foreshadowing what the vibes of this episode are going to be, which is, you know, Prince Zuko, what are you doing with your life, brother? Are you good? Evil? Can morality even be defined like that? Why are you the way you are? Tell me about your upbringing. Tell me about your mother. He is tired and hungry and eventually stumbles upon an Earth Kingdom town, and it's just such an awesome nod to, you know, Clint Eastwood films where he just kind of wanders into some random village and stirs up trouble. Very tropey, obviously, but in the best way possible. He eventually befriends this kid after not ratting him out against the, what are they, like the Earth Kingdom Reserve Army? Basically just a bunch of thugs, but it shows how power is abused, not just in the Fire Nation, but literally anywhere, because it's just seemingly a problem humanity has. Ego and insecurity have no borderlines. The kid introduces Zuko to his family, who offer him food and shelter in exchange for some good old manual labor. I especially love the moment when the father is like, he doesn't need to tell us his name if he doesn't want to, and that chilling look Zuko gives when the man starts talking about his other son who is off fighting in the war. I cannot say this enough, the specific arc of Zuko coming face to face with the horrors the Fire Nation has inflicted upon the Earth Kingdom, him realizing just how indoctrinated he was and how he needs to #escape the culture. It's one of my favourite in the whole show, even though for most of this season, it's never outwardly spoken about, just conveyed through his facial expressions. The structure of the episode is split between 2 timelines. Zuko's present-day experiences with this Earth Kingdom family, and a series of flashbacks dealing with the tragic implosion of his own family, how his mother left and how Ozai rose to power. And these 2 storylines are intercut with such care and intent. Again, there's no B-plot here to distract us, and there's also very little comedy. Avatar has always been a very funny show in my opinion, but the writers are also pretty good most of the time at knowing when to hold back, when to let a moment breathe without undercutting it with a joke. And Zuko Alone might be the best example of that restraint, letting its somber tone sit heavy from start to finish. The flashbacks we get throughout this episode remind me of The Storm quite a lot, not just in that soft, washed out visual palette, but in the way they carry this bittersweet sense of nostalgia. There's something so jarring about seeing an innocent, scarless Zuko navigating an environment that is, frankly, emotionally rotten from the inside out. Of course, royal families have always made for great drama because they're so inherently unstable. Thank God we don't have them in the real world anymore. His sister clearly already has problems, and the only source of unconditional love in his life is Ursa, his mother. Everything else is entirely conditional, based on performance, obedience, and usefulness to the Fire Nation machine. It's a pretty toxic work environment, let's just say that, and it's honestly kind of horrifying to watch unfold, especially in contrast to the youth and innocence of all of these children. Anyway, these haunting flashbacks essentially show us Lu Ten's death from the perspective of Zuko's immediate family, how Ozai saw it as an opportunity to usurp his grieving brother, how Fire Lord Azulon was so appalled by the suggestion that he ordered Ozai to sacrifice his own son in return. Not exactly textbook succession planning there, mate. And how, in the end, Ursa was forced to commit treason in order to protect her favourite child. Now, there's actually a comic which goes way more in depth on all of this called The Search. However, I've actually not read it, so I won't be commenting more on what actually went down here. But I've always kind of loved the moment where Zuko runs to his father, and we get this bleak shot of Ozai's back. Now, I'm pretty sure the comics go on to explain that Ozai and Ursa didn't love each other, that it was an arranged marriage, and was kind of just completely for political reasons. But honestly, in terms of my own headcanon, I've always found it far more powerful if there was some real love there. It makes the whole thing feel so much more tragic, and makes Ozai himself a far more complex and chilling figure. Not just some moustache-twirling evil dad, but someone who chose ambition over intimacy and human connection. But yeah, back to the present day, Zuko bonds with this kid, gifting him the knife which Iroh had given him all those years ago, and even protecting the family from those Earth Kingdom thugs. However, once Zuko has left and the father has gone off to search for his eldest son, whose battalion has apparently been captured, the kid takes matters into his own hands, pulling the very knife Zuko gave him on the soldiers after they come asking for food, getting himself captured in the process. And again, this climactic scene really is just peak Avatar: The Last Airbender. Zuko squares up to these truly awful human beings, and is able to take all but one of them down with his dual swords. However, the main bully is an earthbender, and Zuko obviously struggles to keep up with him. Eventually he is knocked to the floor, and we witness the flashback of his mother leaving, where she essentially tells him to never forget who he is. In one of the best moments of the series so far, Zuko wakes, lashing out with his firebending before revealing to everyone who he really is, Prince of the Fire Nation and heir to the throne. And there's this moment of silence, where the crowd kinda tries to process what just happened. But eventually one of the guys who was previously supporting Zuko in the fight essentially says,
"This man was a bona fide scrub. He can't play. No disrespect whatsoever, but I'm sorry to tell everybody the truth. The man cannot play the game of basketball."
This guy's not a prince. He's an outcast. His own father burned and disowned him. And what I love about this scene is that the crowd's reaction is brutal, especially after all the traumatizing backstory we've just watched. But it's also exactly what would happen in real life. Even Lee, the kid who Zuko just saved, suddenly hates him. It's pretty brutal stuff, but I guess Zuko is just kinda used to this by now. The episode ends in classic Western fashion, with him leaving the village, riding off into the sunset while the terrifying memory of Ozai becoming Fire Lord plays in his head. We get no resolution to this family, they're never heard of again. We have no idea what happened to the son, what happens to the father who went after him. All we know is that Zuko did the right thing and paid the price for it. And in doing so, he took another step away from the life he was born into, and a small step closer to the person he might one day become. Overall, Zuko Alone is obviously one of the most mature and well-written episodes of the entire show. It's also one of the only entries I actually find quite daunting to discuss, since, yes, on the surface the structure is simple and focused, but underneath everything is so heartbreaking and emotionally complex. So yeah, I just hope I did an okay job unpacking it. The MVP goes to Zuko, no surprise there, and let's move on. So, you know when we covered Return to Omashu and I was saying how any episode of Avatar where characters from different factions cross over is pretty much guaranteed to be a banger? Well, The Chase is like the full-blown, big-budget, cinematic universe version of that idea. It's a behemoth of an episode, juggling multiple arcs, advancing the plot, introducing new character dynamics, and culminating in one of the best standoffs we've seen so far, with some of the best action we've seen so far. Honestly guys, it's up there with the strongest entries we've covered up until this point. We begin with Team Avatar, now a sextet instead of a quintet, setting up camp. And considering I didn't go too in-depth on Toph's character during her introduction episode, let me just really quickly speak on her here. Overall, she's obviously just an incredible addition to the cast. Her personality plays off the other three so well, and within about 30 seconds of the chase's opening, you forget that she was ever not there. I love the ongoing joke that Katara, the mum of Team Avatar, was really excited to finally have another girl in the group, only for Toph to be just as immature and rowdy as the guys. And honestly, the trio of Sokka, Aang, and Toph is so funny. It's like the classroom once the teacher leaves. But the real question is, where do I rank this Blind Bandit among the rest of the show's characters? Well, it's difficult, because there's actually many an Avatar fan who claims Toph to be like the best Avatar character of all time, and I definitely wouldn't go that far. She's not on the same level as Zuko, Iroh, and Aang in my opinion. She just doesn't have the same level of emotional and spiritual depth, if you know what I mean. But at the end of the day, it really just depends on what you look for in characters, what kind of people you're drawn to. Like, I would probably only have Toph as the show's 7th best character, which I understand will be sacrilege to many, but please keep in mind that this is one of my favourite pieces of art ever, and I still think Toph is basically a perfect character. Anyway, the first act of the chase explores the new dynamic of Team Avatar, as they try to get a good night's sleep while being in constant pursuit by Team Azula. Toph and Katara have beef over setting up camp and whether Toph should help out or not, and I kind of understand where both parties are coming from, but yeah, eventually the sun rises and Team Avatar have still not slept, which makes everyone very cranky and increases the tension of the group dynamic even more. Oh, and also we get this moment.
We can take them. 3 on 3.
Actually, Toph, there's 4 of us.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't count you. You know, no bending and all.
I can still fight!
Meanwhile, Zuko, still on his ostrich horse, still walking the lone spiritual path of the Wanderer, finds the tracks of Azula's metal train thing and begins following her, and... Did you guys ever play the Subspace Emissary? You know, in Super Smash Bros. Brawl? Because this episode, and especially this scene, just reminds me of it so much. You know, all these different characters, all on their own journeys, converging at the same point to have some legendary crossover skirmish. It's just incredible stuff, man. Eventually, Appa falls asleep because he's been flying all night. Toph and Katara have another argument about setting up camp.
What?
Toph blames Appa for shedding so much and giving away their location to Team Azula, which is of course correct, but Aang yells at her anyway, probably because Appa didn't have any problems with weight before she came on board with her incredibly heavy and pointless wrestling belt. Like, honestly, do they just carry it around with them everywhere they go, along with their food and weapons and money? I'm just intrigued, like, they're literally fighting a war, but no, we gotta bring around the wrestling belt. Anyway, Toph departs from the group.
I'm out of here.
Wait!
Leaving Aang and Katara feeling pretty guilty.
I was so mean to her.
Yeah, you two were pretty much jerks.
Thanks, Sokka.
No problem.
I love that scene. Team Avatar, now back to a quintet, realizes that Toph was correct about the whole shedding fiasco, so give the Sky Bison a nice old clean, before going their separate ways in an attempt to veer Azula off course. Sokka and Katara fly away on Appa while Aang flies away on his glider, leaving a trail of fur for anyone to follow and ending up at this abandoned village, which just like the last episode has clear and obvious Western vibes. And honestly, this show is just so good at pulling from different cinematic traditions without ever losing its distinctly East Asian inspired foundation. It's great stuff. I love that shot of Aang, exhausted, drained, just sitting by his little trail of fur, totally accepting of whatever or whoever is about to come his way. And to be honest, I'm not surprised by his stoicism and embracement of the whole situation. The guy was literally on monk mode for 12 years straight. Meanwhile, Sokka and Katara once again duke it out with Ty Lee and Mei. Once again, the choreography is awesome, especially Ty Lee, who is genuinely just quite a threatening fighter, both with how agile and quick she is, but also the whole chi blocking thing, man. Such a great addition to the world. But once again, Appa saves the day, Seriously, I don't know what they would do without him. Let's hope he sticks around for the rest of the show. Oh, and also...
Was it just me? Or was that guy kinda cute?
Go on, Sokka, my son! While this is all happening, we get this really tender scene between Toph and Uncle Iroh. Straight away, the writers are embedding Toph more deeply into the show's emotional core, not just as the tough new addition to Team Avatar, but as someone with her own wounds and her own arc. Plus, pairing her with Iroh, the show's resident wisdom dispenser, is such a smart move. Their conversation is gentle and honest. They obviously don't know who each other are, which adds quite a lot of dramatic irony, especially when discussing Zuko, who Iroh is revealed to be tracking here. I love the idea that during Zuko Alone, Iroh was just like watching it from some cliff in the distance. Oh man. And I absolutely love that final line where Toph suggests Iroh telling his nephew that he needs him too. Genuinely a really powerful ending to this scene, especially the role reversal of this 12-year-old giving the wise old mentor a run for his money, and leaving him with some real food for thought. Anyway, we then arrive at the iconic climactic duel, which is, once again, really where the chase peaks. We get the official introduction between Aang and Azula, who I think are two characters with a pretty interesting and underrated dynamic. They're two of the most talented bending prodigies on the whole show, who both carry an immense amount of pressure on their shoulders, but mask it in very different ways. Aang through lightheartedness and avoidance, Azula through control and intimidation, and doing hilarious impressions of her brother.
I must find the Avatar to restore my honor.
And once said brother actually arrives, we get a classic three-way Mexican standoff between, let's face it, three of the show's best characters. And it's awesome. Obviously. This entire fight is simply perfect. You can really feel the effort put into the beautifully chaotic 1 versus 1 versus 1 choreography. And how genius is that bit? You know what I'm about to say already. Where Azula chases Aang into that hollowed out room, only to find the floor missing and the Avatar calmly hovering in midair, clearly trying to catch her off guard. She manages to stay upright with her eerie, feline grace, completely composed and reactive, before Zuko charges in like a headless chicken and immediately falls through the gap. It's just such a hilarious moment, which perfectly summarizes the personalities of these three characters. And of course, the chase ends with Aang, Katara, Sokka, Toph, Iroh, and Zuko all cornering Azula. Again, I get such strong subspace emissary vibes from this scene. It's literally just tossing what are, in my opinion, the 7 main characters of the show, the 7 best characters of the show, into the same chaotic space and seeing what happens. It's truly crossover cinema at its finest. Anyway, Azula, being Azula, pretends to surrender, and we get this really subtle moment of Toph perhaps knowing she's lying, which is interesting considering a later scene, but yeah, Azula eventually fires this really cheap shot at Iroh, of all people. I guess because he's probably the most powerful fighter out of all of them. Maybe Sokka's better, but also it's just like a shock tactic, isn't it? We get this absolutely iconic moment where Katara, Toph, Zuko, and Aang all fire their respective elements at Azula. Water, earth, fire, air. Even Sokka throws his boomerang at her, which is genuinely so funny. Like, whoever animated this specific bit is a true legend in my eyes. Build him a statue. Build him a statue in fucking Republic City. And of course, Azula is able to escape, using what I believe is a similar firebending technique to what Zhong executed back in The Deserter. Zuko sits by Iroh, who from this kinda subtle shot of Toph's worried face and feet, I think we can assume is pretty badly injured. However, Zuko basically tells Team Avatar, who include both a healer with magical spirit water, and the kid whose capture he has previously claimed is his entire life purpose, to leave him alone. Leave! And the episode... oh man. And the episode ends with Aang, Katara, Sokka, Toph, Appa, and Momo finally getting some well-earned sleep. The chase basically has everything you could possibly want from an episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Fast-paced, flawless action, sharp character work, a good balance of humor and meaningful plot progression across multiple arcs. It's definitely one of the best episodes we've spoken about so far, and as for the MVP, I'm honestly not entirely sure. This one really is such a tight ensemble piece. Everyone gets their moment, everyone brings something to the table. But since this is technically her second episode and she already feels so essential to the group, and she gets that brilliant scene with Iroh, I think I've got to give it to Toph. But Aang and Azula are also great here. And seriously guys, if you've never played the Subspace Emissary, just trust me, okay? The magic system of Avatar: The Last Airbender is amazing. And I know some people don't like me calling bending a magic system, but it is, that's literally the term. It's a set of rules, limitations, and mechanics that govern supernatural abilities within a fictional world. And in Avatar, it's just so well done. 4 elements, 4 nations. So simple, so intuitive that I wish I'd just come up with it myself. However, what really elevates bending beyond just cool fight mechanics is the deep sense of philosophy and spirituality embedded into the very fabric of the system. Ideas of balance, discipline, and duality, opposing forces. And Bitter Work is the episode which explores this most directly, and it really is a tale of 2 plots with this one, I think. The A plot with Aang beginning his earthbending training under Toph is really solid, no pun intended, but the B plot with Iroh teaching Zuko about the elements is, audience, say it with me, peak Avatar: The Last Airbender. Let's start with the A plot though. After narrowly escaping Azula's clutches in the last episode, Team Avatar finally have a bit of time to rest, and for Aang to actually get to work on earthbending. And straight away it becomes clear that this is not going to come as naturally to Aang as waterbending did. See, earth is the element of substance, of stability, of facing your problems head on, and that is not how Aang operates. He's an airbender, for God's sake, spiritually and temperamentally. He was brought up on evasion and freedom, so learning to stand his ground, to stop running, and to listen to the earth is an immediate struggle. See, the martial art earthbending is based on Hung Gar Kung Fu, is all about rooted stances, power drawn from connection to the ground, and that philosophy that you must face whatever in front of you firmly and without flinching is the exact lesson Aang needs, not just to master the elements, but to grow as a person and become the guy who can take on the Fire Lord. It's also worth noting that while earthbending as a whole draws from Hung Gar, Toph's specific style is actually based on Chow Gar, a substyle of southern praying mantis kung fu, which has a shorter stance and more compact, explosive strikes. It suits her perfectly and speaks to just how much thought was put into her character design and fighting language. And look, this episode isn't just development for Aang, it's development for Toph. It's her learning how to be a teacher, a Sifu. She's not used to explaining herself, not used to being questioned. So this is a story about her learning patience and how to help someone who doesn't learn the way she did. And overall, this plot is just classic Avatar, a clean 3-act mini arc ending in emotional breakthrough. We also get a classic training montage which everyone loves. Shout out to Toph's pointless eye slits here. Sokka falls into a hole, standard stuff, and by the end, Aang finally manages to earthbend after standing his ground against Toph, after she uses his staff as a nutcracker, I think. Again, it's very full circle stuff, very nice, very wholesome. However, I feel like we never watch Aang practice earthbending again, and this is actually one of my biggest flaws with Book 2 Earth. The rest of his training with Toph happens completely off screen, and look, I get that there's a story to tell, we can't have 50 episodes about the philosophy of bending and the spirituality of discipline or whatever, but I don't see why they couldn't sprinkle in a few short scenes of Aang learning earthbending like they do with waterbending. In this episode even. I don't know man, maybe I'm deeping it too much, but it's just always been something which bothers me. Like it just means a few episodes later when we see Aang suddenly executing these really impressive feats of earthbending, it kinda just comes out of nowhere. But anyway, let's now discuss Bitterwork's B-plot, which is always what I personally think about when it comes to this episode. Obviously in the chase, Iroh took a fireball to the chest from his niece and is now resting up. We get these really haunting flashbacks of his son Lu Ten, first as a laughing child, then as a framed photo on an altar, mourned after the failed siege of Ba Sing Se where he lost his life. Eventually Iroh wakes though, and Zuko asks if they can continue his training. He wants to learn more advanced firebending, especially as he's probably gonna run into Azula again. And basically everything spoken between these two characters in this episode is legendary, not just because of the insight it gives into the philosophy and spirituality of the 4 elements, but because it also deepens our understanding of Zuko himself, his anger, his impatience, his constant push for power, and how Iroh, gently but firmly, tries to guide him towards something healthier. I especially love this quote.
I'm as proud as ever.
Prince Zuko, pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. True humility is the only antidote to shame.
Anyway, Iroh tries to teach Zuko how to lightning bend, but it keeps on just blowing up in his face, like everything always does. See, to generate lightning, you kind of need to have dealt with any inner turmoil.
What turmoil?
So I'm not really sure how Azula can do it, but I imagine her mind is quite different to Zuko's. She's far more confident and self-assured, so I'm sure she thinks she has no inner turmoil, which I guess to the Lords of Lightning is basically the same thing. Anyway, Zuko is unable to do it, so Iroh decides to instead teach him how to redirect lightning, which is already something we've seen him do twice. And this is one of the best scenes in all of Avatar. Not only does Iroh teaching Zuko this skill eventually lead to one of Avatar's single greatest moments, it also represents everything that makes their dynamic so special. It's a moment of trust and mutual respect and passing down your legacy. And thematically it ties Zuko's whole arc together, learning not to react with rage or aggression, but to absorb what's been thrown at you, channel it, and send it somewhere else. I especially love the moment where Iroh is drawing the elemental symbols in the dirt and explaining the 4 elements, how they're not just combat styles, but ways of life, power, substance, freedom, change. All essential, all incomplete on their own. We get this line.
It is important to draw wisdom from many different places. If we take it from only one place, it becomes rigid and stale.
Which, honestly, out of all the lessons this show teaches, might just be the one that has stuck with me the most. I'll often reference this line when engaging in, spiritual discussions with people, just because I think it's so true. But it becomes even better when you realize that Iroh isn't just talking about bending here, he's talking about Zuko, about the rigid worldview his nephew has inherited, about the Fire Nation's obsession with domination, about the need to open your heart to others, the same journey I'm sure Iroh went through. It's very wholesome and powerful stuff in my opinion, and links very nicely to everything Aang has to deal with in the same episode, as well as the general themes of the show, which, if I had to sum up in one word, would be balance. Anyway, once Zuko has got the theory part of the teaching locked down, he asks his uncle to shoot lightning at him for real so that he can redirect it. Which obviously Iroh isn't gonna do, but I do kind of understand why Zuko thought this was gonna happen. He eventually goes out into a thunderstorm in what is surely one of the most melodramatic scenes of the whole show. I reckon they just about get away with it though, and the episode ends with Zuko shouting at the sky and crying. We never do see Zuko generate lightning himself across the series, which I do think is a slightly missed opportunity, as I feel like so much of his arc is about dealing with his inner turmoil. But we do see him redirect lightning later, which, as I've already said, is one of the best moments in the whole show. But yeah, Bitter Work is yet another amazing episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. We're honestly just in such an incredible run now, so it's very exciting for me. Oh yeah, and the MVP for Bitter Work is obviously Iroh. The Library is another solid episode of Book 2 Earth, and quite a big turning point in this season actually. We begin with Team Avatar seemingly just flying around, going on mini vacations, being kids. Aang is still learning earthbending and waterbending, but I guess there's always time for some rest and relaxation. Sokka, however, disagrees with this, saying that they need more intel on the Fire Nation if they're gonna win the war. And I love how much responsibility Sokka personally takes upon himself to solve this century-long geopolitical conflict. The guy is 15 years old, for God's sake. What were you doing at 15? I was watching this show. They eventually end up in the Misty Palms Oasis, a dilapidated spring with dodgy sandbenders and the most extra bartender in the Earth Kingdom since Kim, the infamous bartender from the Hujin provinces who was unfortunately eaten by a dragon in 32 AG. You gotta have some fun with it sometimes, guys. Anyway, Team Avatar eventually get talking to Professor Zay, head of anthropology at Ba Sing Se University, who is very happy to meet an airbender. But again, and I spoke about this in my Book 1 video, shouldn't he be way more in shock? Like, brother, you are meeting a living, breathing airbender, someone from a race who was literally thought to be extinct for a century. And also, wouldn't he know Aang is the Avatar? Wouldn't he be able to put 2 and 2 together? Like, he's clearly a smart and well-travelled guy. Again, not to be nitpicky, but it just doesn't make sense to me. It's like one of my only proper flaws with the show. But yeah, Team Avatar and Professor Zay end up flying into the desert on Appa to search for Wan Shi Tong's library, said to be the greatest repository of knowledge in the entire world, and a place which would probably have a map of the Fire Nation. We get this joke.
Oh, delightful! I only wish I spoke his tongue. Oh, the stories this beast could tell. Shush, chatty monkey.
And soon enough they find the library. Toph, who is blind and more of an audiobook kind of girl, stays outside with Appa, while Aang, Katara, Sokka and Professor Zay descend by rope into the library, where they come face to face with Wan Shi Tong, he who knows 10,000 things, and who for my money is one of the best spirits in the whole show. He's right up there with Ko in my opinion, and shares a similar vibe to the Face Stealer actually. It's just a combination of the design and the voice and the name and the context. Very creepy and kind of terrifying. If not a tiny bit naive. But at the end of the day, I just love owls, they're my spirit animal, so yeah. It is also in our introduction to Wan Shi Tong that we realise that this is the very same library my guy Admiral Zhao mentioned during the Siege of the North. Which is a really nice bit of connective tissue actually, that links Wan Shi Tong's deep-rooted paranoia about humans to the Fire Nation's long history of exploiting knowledge as a weapon. Anyway, we get a few moments of note here, such as Aang seeing this drawing of a lion turtle, which will become relevant later, as well as this joke, which for me is actually one of the funniest in the whole show.
Aang, did you know in a past life you were left-handed?
I always knew I was special.
Eventually, with the help of one of Wan Shi Tong's foxy assistants, Team Avatar find themselves in a planetarium and realise that there will be a solar eclipse in a few months' time, one that will leave firebenders temporarily powerless, similar to the waterbenders during the Siege of the North when the moon disappeared. However, this crucial discovery is quickly overshadowed by Wan Shi Tong's realisation that Team Avatar came to the library not as scholars, but as wages of war. And we are gifted yet another brilliant moment of nuance from this kids' show, as Sokka attempts to bargain with the spirit, claiming that the Fire Nation is evil and that they need this information for the good of the world or whatever. And obviously, we know he's kind of right. But Wan Shi Tong has absolutely no interest in moral framing. To him, Sokka is simply reciting the same justification that every side in every war has used before, each one convinced that they were the exception. So it's just one of those very interesting, perspective-based moral dilemmas, you know? Very mature stuff, actually. Anyway, Wan Shi Tong starts sinking the building. Team Avatar are just about able to escape, but Professor Zay decides to stay, claiming he could spend an eternity pouring through the library's knowledge, which is actually quite a powerful and bittersweet moment, in my opinion, especially as we definitely never see him again in anything ever. So, Team Avatar make it out, and everything seems great. They acquired the knowledge they were looking for, they escaped the terrifying serpentine spirit owl, they were even able to ditch the nerdy professor. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. However, in one of the most devastating turns in the entire series, Appa is gone, taken by sandbenders while an impaired Toph was holding the library up. And can we talk about these sandbenders for a second? Truly some of the most despicable human beings in the entire show. They literally came across a 12-year-old blind girl holding up a sinking building in the middle of the desert, and their first thought was to steal what must have looked like her pet and only mode of transportation, and leave her there to die. It's really quite crazy when you think about it, and the episode makes no attempt to soften the blow. It ends with Aang breaking down in tears, one of the only times I feel like where the show allows an episode to end in pure tragedy, with no joke, no lesson, and no immediate sense of hope. So, like I said at the start, the library is another solid entry into Book 2 Earth, and an undeniably important one. However, if I have one lingering issue with the episode, and the reason it probably won't land especially high in my personal ranking, it's the structure. See, this is the point where Book 2 really commits to its long, serialized arc, and that arc is fantastic. But the library has always felt slightly awkward to me, like an episode engineered to deliver two huge plot beats. Team Avatar discovering the solar eclipse and losing Appa. It almost feels as though the writers worked backwards from those necessities, then built an episode whose primary job is to move the pieces into place, if that makes sense. And to be clear, both of these moments are excellent. The eclipse is a brilliant plot point, and Appa's abduction is emotionally devastating. But because the episode is doing so much heavy lifting, it can feel less like a complete story in its own right, and more like the first domino in a much longer, much heavier chain. Effective, absolutely, but ultimately more set up than payoff. So yeah, don't get me wrong. The Library is a good episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I still probably wouldn't change anything about it. It does exactly what it needs to do, kickstarting one of the strongest stretches in the entire series. I just don't know if it stands on its own 2 feet like lots of the other episodes in this season, if that makes sense. Anyway, we'll give the MVP to Sokka here, and that, my friends, is the first half of Book 2 Earth. The first 10 episodes of Avatar's legendary second season. And personally, I think this is a really good point to take stock, you know? To pause and have a reflection. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to be jumping into any concluding in-depth analysis here. I'll leave that for the second part of this video, where we will be tackling episodes 11 to 20. But what I can do is thank you for making it to the end of this video. I really can't put into words how it feels to discuss my favourite show of all time, and have so many people listen to me, especially as I'm prone to just go on tangents about, you know, the philosophy of the hippies in the Cave of Two Lovers for 10 minutes. So yeah, it is a real honour to be able to share my love of Avatar: The Last Airbender in the way that I want, and have people care, so thank you again. And before we leave, let's just do a quick ranking of these first 10 episodes of Book 2 Earth, from worst to best, in my very subjective opinion. Number 10, Avatar Day. Number 9, The Library. Number 8, The Swamp. Number 7, Return to Omashu. Number 6, The Avatar State. Number 5, The Cave of Two Lovers. Number 4, Bitter Work. Number 3, The Blind Bandit. Number 2, The Chase. And number 1, Zuko Alone. And now let's see how all these new entries slot into our overall ranking of the series so far, which after crunching the numbers ended up looking something like this. And it really is a case of greens at the front, blues at the back, if you know what I mean. I have to preface, again, I love Book 1, but I do just think Book 2 basically improves on everything, and it's only gonna get better in the second part of this video, where we will be discussing every episode of this beautiful show from the desert to the crossroads of destiny, which is gonna be unreal and should not take too long to come out after this one, as I have been working on them at the same time. But before we leave, let's not forget what we're all really here for, which is the MVP rankings. Adding all the medals from this episode, here's how the race is looking. In first place, we have a new frontrunner. I am of course referring to Sokka of the Southern Water Tribe. Wang Fire, Captain Boomerang, who holds 7 MVP awards to his name. 7! And honestly, I would not be surprised if he won this whole thing, which is very interesting in regards to my supposed 3 favourite characters, and something I'll talk more about later. Anyway, in second place we have Aang, still with 6 points. The poor kid somehow didn't get any in the first half of Book 2, which is kind of crazy. However, do not count out this little monk yet. We've got a ton of ground still to cover. Third place is occupied by the Dragon of the West with 4 points. Fourth is shared between Zuko and Katara, both on 3 points. Fifth place is occupied by newcomer Toph on 2 points, which kind of shows you the instant impact she has. And then we have Chong, Hugh, Boomy, Roku, Zhongzhong, Zhao, and Azula all on 1 point. Talk about a dream blunt rotation. Anyway, I think that's everything, so once again, thank you for watching. Please let me know your own rankings in the comments, what you agree with, what you disagree with. I reckon people will think I've underrated The Library and overrated The Cave of Two Lovers. But honestly, I'm just trying to relay the opinions which have formed in my mind and heart and soul over the past decade of watching and loving this show. They're always prone to change, and I'm sure when I look back at this episode ranking in another 10 years, I'll say I got loads of stuff wrong. But that's the interesting thing about time. It is an illusion, and so is death. Until our paths cross again.
Even if you're lost, you can't lose the love because it's in your heart.